I find the story we read this morning about Jesus in the temple one of the most intriguing stories in our Gospels. On a number of different levels. First are the very actions themselves. The story says Jesus made a whip out of cords and began to whip the people out of the temple. It says specifically the sheep and the cattle. I'm not sure what Jesus had against the sheep and the cattle, but he was kind of like the first century Indiana Jones, making them leave the temple, whipping them out of the temple. And then the story goes that he continued to then overturn the tables, and this image of him whipping and overturning tables and the coins flying and people probably wondering what's going on. Who is this person? It's a rather powerful image. But I also find it intriguing because it's one of the first or few stories in some ways, if not the only one, in which we see Jesus angry. We catch a glimpse, in some ways, of his humanity. It's one of the few occasions, few stories that we ever read in the Scripture in which Jesus is, in some ways, I think some of the image we have is of Jesus as this Buddha, calm, quiet person. I mean, most of the art renderings we have of him, he's this young man with blue eyes, white skin, calm, quiet, peaceful. After all, he's the reconciler. And then we are hit right between the eyes with this story of a Jesus who enters the temple and is just quite honestly, it's obviously apparent, is just ticked off. It's a story that throws me for the loop. Little pop culture reference. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Network. It's an old movie, fairly old movie, but there's this scene in it in which the TV news anchor essentially he's kind of a deranged kind of guy, disturbed, but he begins to tell his listeners, he says, I want you to go outside and raise your hands, and as loud as you can say it, say, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And everybody all over the country raising their arms going, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Did anybody here remember that, or am I the only one? Thank you, Randy. I kind of see this story of Jesus in the temple, and he's like, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And it's such a startling image. It makes me step back. And the first question I wonder about, the first question I wrestle with is, what is he mad about? What has made him so passionate about it? In many ways it is, he says, you have made my Father's house into a marketplace. And the practice in the temple at that time was they would go into the temple, and in order to worship, in order to kind of have access to God, you would have to make a sacrifice. And the larger your sacrifice, the more connected to God you were. And so they would have people gather from all over the world, and they would gather at the temple, and there would be doves and cattle and sheep, each worth so much that each would then create an even deeper connection to God through their theology, their ideas about who God was. And you had these tables, these money changers, because these people would gather from all over the world to come to the temple, and they need to exchange. Much like if we went to another country, they need to exchange money. And the money changers and lenders, if you couldn't even afford it, they would lend you money in order to in order to be able to purchase a dove at least have access to God in that way. It's kind of a payday lender, so to speak, right? And this made Jesus angry. To turn God's grace into something that can be bought. And if you couldn't afford it, something that couldn't be paid for. The injustice of it all. To turn faith, to turn religion, to turn their society into this marketplace where I only get God's love if I can pay for it. If I can give you something for it. There are many sociology of religion folks who say, you know what, that's the church today, right? Consumer church. They come to church thinking, well, what services can the church provide for me? Access to God, to each other, and I pay something for that, whether that's sacrifice of time or treasure. But what makes Jesus so angry is the injustice of it all. That there are folks who couldn't get access to God's grace and love and compassion, or at least were denied it because they couldn't afford it. It made Jesus passionate angry. Now, one caveat to that. I looked at this story as I read it over and over again. It never says Jesus hated anyone. He was angry at injustice and turning God's love into something small rather than something huge and free and welcoming. Their observation, the disciples, their observation was, look how much zeal he has, how much passion he has for God's grace, how much joy he has. And it's interesting, the first 12 verses of this chapter 2 of the Gospel of John, really starts with John's story of Jesus transforming water into wine. It's an odd story. The only one it contain, this story only shows up in the Gospel of John. And if you remember the story, he goes to a wedding with his mother and the other disciples, and they run out of wine, and Mary says, well, Jesus, can you do something about this? And then the story is he takes these jars of water, jars that were kind of full of water used for purification, for ritual purification, we're told in that story. And Jesus turns those waters intended for religious purification, and he turns them into wine. And it ain't just any kind of wine, it's the good stuff. And is that not an image of taking how religion is turned into kind of ritualistic purification, or however you want to describe it, just kind of going rote day to day, and instead that faith is really about a joyful abandon. That faith really is about zeal and passion for something so passionate, it makes you angry when God's love and grace is denied. And I'll be honest, I have to ask myself, what do I feel so passionate about that I would get that angry myself? What am I so passionate about, so incredibly wanting to embrace that I say, no, we can't do this anymore? What am I that passionate about as an individual and as a church? It's a question we have to ask ourselves. In which it's not some rote thing, but actually is at the heart of our lives. Are we passionate about our kids, about our youth? So passionate, we're really interested in knowing them and that they know God's love and grace. So passionate that we want to show them the joy of the gospel. Are we passionate enough when someone comes in our door as a stranger? Are we passionate enough about God's grace to show I'm really interested in you? Not because you're some prospective member, but because God's love and God's grace is present in you and us, and I want to know you. Are we passionate enough to stand up and speak out for those who might be excluded by God's grace and love, or refugees, or the homeless person? It's a question we have to ask ourselves. In what ways are we willing to go to the temple, not in hate, but to stand up, maybe in anger, and say, no more? We have that much passion in our faith? Or do we make our faith such a small thing to be sold in the marketplace? It's a hard question. Hard question I struggle with. What am I passionate about? I remember being struck, the horrible reality, the tragedy at the high school shooting a number of weeks ago. We, in many ways, sad to say, still will find ourselves kind of leaving that behind. But I remember being struck by the passion of the young people. And for sure, there was some anger there. I'd be angry, people shooting machine guns in my high school. But there was a passion there that I was taken aback by. And to be honest, I'm kind of being self-reflective here. The older I get, the more cynical I get in some ways. As I'm entering my get off my lawn stage, so to speak, I find myself a little bit more cynical. And I found myself responding to these young people and saying, oh, they're just young. They're hopeful. That really, I don't know how much difference it'll really make. I've been around too long to see how this debate comes up and goes. But I have been awed by their passion. They won't back off from the truth they experience. Now, whether you agree with them or not, it is that passion, that hope, that is faith. And one last caveat. As I thought about this, and I never really thought about this before, really till the lectionary this past Tuesday, a group I gather with, we often think of Jesus as this young guy, right? 30s, yeah, that's young, right? In his time and in his place, Jesus was an old man. The average life expectancy was 35. He's not some young whippersnapper. He's a passionate old man. That gives hope for this old man. That I'll learn from the young and the older to be passionately about God's grace. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.